finally, to get the ball rolling, I would like to introduce Margaret Burnham. She is an associate professor at the Northeastern University School of Law. Professor Burnham began her career at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, litigating school desegregation cases. In 1978, she was appointed an Associate Justice of the Boston Municipal Court, and in 1989 returned to law practice as a founding partner of Boston's first law firm headed by African American women. Professor Burnham has had fellowships at Harvard's Du Bois Institute and Radcliffe College's Bunting Institute. In 1992, former South African President Nelson Mandela asked Margaret Burnham to serve on an international commission that investigated human rights violations committed by the African National Congress. That commission was a precursor to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission established after the 1994 election in South Africa. Professor Burnham's fields of expertise include civil rights, human rights, and employment. She has held teaching appointments at MIT, Boston College, and Brandeis University. Not so coincidentally, Margaret Burnham is also a member of the Board of Directors of South Africa Partners. So please join me in welcoming her and navigating us through this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. And we have a very interesting and exciting program ahead of us. And I want to try to frame it a bit so that we can move on and hear from Justice Sachs. Why, one might ask, given the daunting challenges facing his country and its judicial system, would a leading jurist like Albie Sachs turn his attention to public art and matters of design? How can the paintings on the walls of South Africa's highest court affect the justice experienced by its long-deprived and increasingly impatient citizens? Let me suggest 3 points of departure for what will be a fascinating discussion on the relationship of public art to public justice and to public memory. The first is a looming political crisis, the challenge of managing the heightened expectations of South Africa's citizens. South Africa stands today as our generation's preeminent illustration of the efficacy and possibility of peaceful democratic transition. But despite these remarkable events, the defeat of apartheid, the adoption of the new constitution, the election of 1994, and the successful handover from President Mandela to President Mbeki, South Africa has yet to achieve an enduring transition. The state must still bridge an enormous economic divide among its citizens, create a livable infrastructure, redistribute public space and wealth, and eliminate the deep fissures reflected in its segregated geography. These challenges are as mundane as they are fundamental, urgent, and pervasive. Township dwellers are demanding taps, housing, plumbing, and electricity, while in the rural areas, the largely landless majority has little access to basic health and education and few markets for their goods. And having spent decades mobilizing against apartheid, South Africans are both highly organized and politically conscious. They want to see results from their victory over apartheid, while for its part, the government faces the difficult reality that it always takes longer and costs more to deliver public goods than expected or promised. I need only remind those of us who have had to stumble across our city here in Boston of the Big Dig. Multiply that 1,000 times and you have a sense of the proportion of the problems in South Africa. The second point concerns an impending crisis in public morality. South Africa has pointed the world in a new direction, away from ethnic splintering and towards multi-ethnic governance and a diverse civic culture. While the Balkans exploded, while above it Rwanda imploded, South Africa looked beyond its old wars to define a complex, postmodern ethic of equality, human rights, and peaceful coexistence. Borrowing generously from Western ideas about individual rights and from traditional African concepts of community, its citizens set out to create a new national identity, defined simultaneously by equality and difference and by the submerged individual and the emerged community. As the instruments to embody this new ethic, they chose state structures that are now much admired and imitated around the world. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the new Constitution. But in choosing to turn from the past, South Africa gambled that its brightest days were ahead of it. And whether, given the depressed global economy, the impending war in the Middle East, and the political upheavals across the African continent, whether that is true remains to be seen. As it now struggles to meet the demands of apartheid's victims as against the property claims of the old white elite, the government must be able to demonstrate that national unity is not just an attractive ideal, but that rather it can deliver where racial and ethnic factionalism cannot. Many South Africans have not yet been persuaded on that point. My third and final point here follows from the political and the moral crisis, and it concerns the potential crisis in justice. As the most progressive articulation of state responsibility and individual rights in the world today, the new South African Constitution, unlike our own, endeavors explicitly to protect socioeconomic rights to health, to housing, to food, and to water. The Constitutional Court has not been shy in enforcing these broad positive rights. Two recent decisions make clear that the Court does not consider these to be merely paper promises. In one case, decided in the year 2000, the Court ordered state authorities to construct housing for landless, homeless residents of the Cape area. And just last July of 2002, the Court ordered public health authorities to make widely available to pregnant women the antiretroviral drug Nevirapine, a critical preventive in the campaign against HIV/AIDS. These initiatives place the Court in the midst of political controversies and potentially in contention with the government, which holds ultimate authority for cutting up the fiscal pie. In scratching beneath its surface to give real meaning to the Constitution's guarantees, the Court speaks both to the redistributive crisis, aligning itself with powerless AIDS victims and homeless squatters, and to the ethical crisis, adhering to a vision of democratic inclusion in its broad reading of positive rights. Now, what does any of this have to do with public art, public justice, and public memory? Hopefully, Justice Sachs will describe his court's new home, located on the site of one of the country's most infamous prisons, and I will pass him on to you in just a moment. If it succeeds, this new courthouse will speak to exactly the tensions I've described here. Literally, it builds on, and yet it inters the past. It will portray justice as both accessible and exalted, a posture best captured by Nelson Mandela himself. It will preserve and perpetuate South Africa's most important moral export, which is reconciliation. And finally, it will replace the old didactic portrayal of justice, the scales and the blindfolded ladies, with images reflecting real justicia, where humans and not goddesses or inanimate icons create and then resolve conflict. And now, I want to introduce both of our speakers, and you'll hear first from Justice Sachs and then from Paul Tucker. Justice Sachs sits on the Constitutional Court of South Africa and was actively engaged in negotiations leading up to the new Constitution as a member of the ANC's Constitutional Committee and of its national executive. He was educated first in Cape Town, where he hails from and now still lives, and he attended university there, obtained his law degree there, and then moved to the University of Sussex in England, where he obtained the PhD degree. He has taught on law faculties in England, in Mozambique, and in the United States. While working in the movement and teaching in Mozambique, Justice Sachs was, in 1988, nearly killed by a car bomb. In 1990, Judge Sachs became the founding director of the South Africa Constitution Studies Center at the University of London. Justice Sachs has written extensively on culture, on gender rights, on art, and on the environment. His book, The Jail Diary of Albie Sachs, was dramatized for the Royal Shakespeare Company, and his second book, The Soft Vengeance of a Freedom Fighter, which deals with his recovery from the car bomb, is presently being dramatized for film, and he will speak to us tonight about whatever it is he wants to speak to us about. Now, after we hear from Justice Sachs, you'll hear from Professor Paul Tucker, who teaches art at the University of Massachusetts in Boston and has been there since 1978. Professor Tucker is also in the midst of a public art project, which is certainly closer to home for us. It's the sculpture project at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and he will bring us up to speed on that. Professor Tucker is the founder and first director of that project, Arts on the Point. His many publications include several books on Claude Monet and other Impressionists. He has curated exhibits, several of them, on the work of Monet, and he is considered one of the world's foremost authorities on that artist. Professor Tucker serves as chairman of the board of the Terra Foundation for the Arts, which is the nation's premier philanthropic organization for the propagation of American art here and abroad. I bring you first, Albie Sachs.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for that very lovely introduction and for dealing with all the serious stuff. I can now go ahead and give a very unjudged-like, far more fancy-free presentation, which is what I'd really like to do this evening. And my story starts with the Nevirapine case to which you referred. The 11 judges of the Constitutional Court are about to file into the courtroom to take up our seats to deliver judgment. What would you say here? Hand down our opinion. And my colleague, Sandile Ngobo, said, "Albie, are you going to cry today? I've got a spare handkerchief for you." The reason he said that was that about 2 years earlier, he had been the person who handed down judgment on behalf of the court in a case in which we dealt with a would-be airline steward who had passed all the entrance exams with flying colors but turned out to be HIV positive, and he'd been refused employment. He went to the High Court, he lost, he came to our court, claiming that he was a victim of unfair discrimination. And sitting in the court to hear the judgment, behind the advocates in their robes, were a large number of people, mostly young, black and white, men and women, wearing T-shirts saying HIV positive. And they had come to hear our decision in that case. And Sandile, my colleague, read out the crucial extracts of the decision on behalf of our court, saying the mere fact that other airlines, as a matter of good commercial practice, refused to allow people living with HIV to serve on board could not be a factor to be taken into account in determining the constitutional rights of South Africans. That the affliction of living with HIV causing so much prejudice and marginalization made it completely untenable and unconstitutional for a state airline to participate in that kind of marginalization. And the South African Airways were ordered to employ Mr. Hoffman. As we left the court and filed into the passage at the back, we heard cheering. and I cried. I cried partly because of the emotion of living in a country afflicted by HIV and feeling the emotion of all the persons in the court. But I cried because I felt so proud to be part of an institution that could do justice in a contemporary sense to people who had turned to us to receive justice as human beings. Sandile Ngobo now wanted to know, maybe he wanted to take some of the burden off me. We were about to give our decision in the Nevirapine case. And I mention him in particular because, amongst other things, he was educated here at Harvard University. There's a direct connection with this part of the world. And he was being warm and friendly to me because he knew that when I spoke to different audiences in the United States, I told that story and mentioned his name. And I said, don't worry, Sandile, I think I'll be all right. You'll have to wait to find out whether I cried or not. The story goes back to another moment of considerable emotion. I've just returned to South Africa after 24 years of exile. And I had this intense conviction. The day I get back to Cape Town after seeing my mother after many years, I'm going to climb Table Mountain, which I did. And the second, not quite equal, but also important, imaginative certainty was the first Thursday night that I was home. I would go to the City Hall for the symphony concert. And I went there. That was part of my reconnection with Cape Town. And I remember during the interval, someone came up to me and said, Albie Sachs, welcome back. For 20 years, you never missed a concert except when you went to jail. It was important for me. It was saddening to see an almost totally white orchestra and almost totally white audience. Many of them people I'd sat with before, a little grayer now. Lovely to see them again, lovely to hear the music. But provoking this kind of idea, is it right in the new democratic South Africa, when there are so many needs to have a symphony orchestra? And the answer is yes. We are part of the world. We have a right of access to the great, glorious music of the world. But is it right that the orchestra should be white people only? No. Is it right that the audience should be overwhelmingly white? No. And many people then were raising the argument that we must cease to be Euro-centered and become Afro-centered. And the two were seen as in sharp conflict with each other, an either-or situation. Either culture in South Africa is dominated by European music and literature and languages and ideas, or it's totally African in character. And they dominated in the past, now it's our turn to dominate them. And that's when this new ism emerged in my mind. We've had many isms in the world and we haven't always benefited from them. The ism which I invented was, now it's our turn ism. And it's one of the most dangerous isms in the whole world, of people who have been oppressed, who suffered, saying we are turning the tables, now it's our turn. And part of the glory of the transformation in South Africa was the great majority of people who had suffered indescribable, unspeakable forms of pain and indignity. Instead of saying, now it's our turn to heap that on those who caused us so much hurt, said, how can we turn the country around? How can we break the cycle? How can we create a land in which everybody feels free? And that doesn't mean that things go on as before, business as usual. It means there has to be transformation, but it's a transformation which everybody participates. And the problem of the symphony orchestra hasn't been resolved yet, but it's very much on the table. And one can see in different areas we are making progress. In opera, for which the orchestra would play, relatively easy. You put on Fidelio before the first democratic elections, and here's the great, glorious music of Beethoven exalting the theme of democracy and freedom. And yet the audience is overwhelmingly white, and I find myself isolated in the audience because when the captives come out of prison at the end, I think of the first act, I'm almost crying. I don't spend all my life crying, but just special moments. And in the interval, the people are saying, wasn't that a lovely set? And didn't so-and-so's voice really come out beautifully in a particular aria? And I'm saying, weren't you living in South Africa? Didn't you feel the emotion of our prisoners coming out of prison? If only the audience who felt that emotion could have been, the people outside could have been in that hall. And if only the people in that hall could have felt a little bit more like the people outside. And that's what the future of our music and opera is really going to be. And we're getting there. The first major contemporary style opera with a large audience is presently playing to packed houses after being in Durban at the State Theatre in Johannesburg, Princess Magoga, with Sibongile Khumalo, our great singer, participating, playing the role of a Zulu princess in an extremely patriarchal society, establishing space for women through song, through tradition, through legend, encouraging other women to sing and establish their freedom through song within the Zulu tradition, but at the same time enlarging the scope of Zulu tradition. Professor Khumalo, the author of the work, supported by people of all different cultural backgrounds, in a modern proscenium, a modern hall. It's not a choice between Africa and Europe. It's creating a people-centered, with everything we can get from Europe that's useful, but for the first time allowing the powerful well springs of African musicality, which played such a role for us in exile, in prison, wherever we were, so real as part and parcel of the struggle for democracy, now reaching onto the stage in terms of a contemporary great opera. How can you break the cycle of domination, subordination, simply changing around who happens to exercise command and control? And it's a problem for the world, not just for our country. I'm going to refer to somebody else who spent quite a while in the Boston area, Pumla, Gobodo Madikizela, just brought out a most beautiful book describing her experience working for South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a young psychiatrist, psychologist, going to meet the man, a youngish African woman, going to meet Eugene de Kock, head of the hit squads, self-confessed murderer, assassin, killer, on a massive scale inside South Africa, outside South Africa. But in addition to being this cruel person, the embodiment, the epitome of centuries of domination, of violence, of control, the man coming with guns, with power, with authority, with arrogance, and she's going to meet the man. And she has her courage, she has her understanding of death psychology through her training, and she has her constitution, and that's all. And in the book she describes the extraordinary encounters when he, at one stage, she finds herself almost against her will, discovering a certain element of humanity, of self-interrogation. She's surprised, and she touches him, almost involuntarily, and then recoils. And he says to her, Pumla, on first-name terms, how do you feel touching this hand that has pulled so many triggers? And she describes in detail her reactions and his reactions. To me, this is possibly the finest story to come out of the extraordinary range of stories on our Truth Commission. But it says something about our country. She is not going to interrogate a captive with a view to showing the world how ugly and evil and terrible he is and how powerful the new state is. She's going to see how does somebody become like he became? What were the roots of it? And what possibilities are there of recuperating, recovering, allowing that person to find some dignity through some self-analysis, through some honest contrition in terms of what he's done. And the significance of the story goes beyond an encounter between two individuals. It's an encounter between two societies at their most extreme. And if they can meet, then anything becomes possible, and our country can knit itself together again. The third person with a Boston connection, an artist, Kim Berman, who lived here and taught for many years. She's just donated a 6-piece panel with pictures on both sides to the art collection of the Constitutional Court. And on the one side, which will become the far side of the panel, and these are large panels, human height size, images of burning townships, of struggle in darkness, in a kind of charcoal, which she did in 1989, while she was here in Boston, 1989. On the front side, the bright, vivid, incandescent light of bushfires, which all of us know in South Africa, the Veld Fire as it's called. And the bushfires to her are the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It burns, it scorches, but it clarifies. And this powerful illumination will be in the gallery of the new court building, being constructed, as Margaret said, on the site of the old Fort Prison. We deliberately chose that site for our new building. We could have gone to Midrand, wonderful new fancy office blocks, a lot of investment there. We felt, no, that's not where our court belongs. We could have gone downtown, the old post office. It would have been too crowded. Our independence wouldn't have been shown. We chose the site of the old Fort Prison, where we say with a dubious pride, we have the only prison in the world where both Gandhi and Mandela were locked up. No one else can claim that. But we chose the site because we wanted to show this turning around of the negativity of the past, the violence, the hatred, the despair, the cruelty. How you don't deny that these things happen, but you don't live in the past, and you take that bitter energy and you convert it into positivity on that site, so that anybody coming to the court will remember where our Constitution came from. The courage, the determination, eventually the good sense and accommodation with others, of those who suffered in that prison. Anybody going to visit the new museums that will be there, the Mandela Papers that will be there, going on to Constitution Hill, where we will have the Commission for Gender Equality, the Legal Aid Board, the Commission for Human Rights, this one vast space of humanity, will know that we are not simply living in the past, that we've moved forward and the flagship Constitutional Court will be there. And as you walk up what the architects call the Great African Steps, and you'll see the worst of the prisons, number 4, the so-called native jail on the right. And on the left, you will look through the plate glass windows, and you'll see Kim Berman's picture. And you'll see wonderful large tapestries we've got, huge, by Marlene Dumas, called The Benefit of the Doubt. The doubt which is the foundation of legal reasoning. Nothing is taken for granted. Everything has to be established. The doubt which I understand is central to the very functioning of Ford Hall. It's what you're all about, questioning, interrogating, looking for enlightenment, taking nothing for granted. We have a beautiful, sensitive portrait, we believe like a nude self-portrait by William Kentridge, one of our great artists. We have work by many other contemporary South African artists who've generously given their work because we had no funds to acquire artwork for a court. And the gallery will be part and parcel of the whole ensemble, so that the imagination of our artists, the vitality, the diversity, the variety, some famous, some to become famous, others completely unknown, will be reflected. For South Africans, you'd be interested to know we're expecting a collection of Gerard Sekorte's work, Dumeli Feni's, together with the other artwork that I've mentioned. But that is just one feature of the new building. We asked the architects who entered for an international competition to give us a building that would be friendly, inviting, warm, intimate, not like the usual court building. If I go into a magistrate's court in South Africa, I feel guilty of something, I don't know what. There's something in the architecture, the coldness, the hardness of it. We want a building that someone will enter and say, I am secure here, my basic rights will be protected, I am welcome here. Whether I come from a poor rural background, whether I'm a business person in the city, in financial services, whoever my parents and grandparents were, I will be respected in this court. I am welcome in this court. And so it's a building you can see into from outside and you can see out from inside, with lots of natural light showing the passage of the day and a natural climate, so that we avoid not only the expense of putting up a box that traps the heat that you then have to cool down and expel, but also creates a sense of being in a natural climate and not in an artificial climate. And to achieve this, we trap the cool night air of Johannesburg, pass it over ponds onto wet rocks. It will seep into the building during the day. We have 11 chimneys to draw out the warm air. And in the next week or two, advertisements are going to be placed in major newspapers. There will be spots on the radio inviting the artists in each of our 9 provinces, each to adopt a chimney. We'll give them the specifications, and we will say, Let this be the chimney for KwaZulu-Natal. Let that be the chimney for Mpumalanga, and so on. So that there's a sense of national involvement of the artist community all over the country, that diversity within a basic format that will provide some sense of coherence to that particular project. We are going to invite school children to help design the tiles for all the washrooms. We want the children to think, what does it mean to have a constitutional court? What does it mean for the Constitution to have extensive provisions protecting the rights of the child? How can you reflect that in imaginative, artistic terms? And then to place it in the washrooms. We're going to have certain of the 32 areas of artistic invention. Certain of the activities will be thrown open to broad public competition. In others, we're going to invite selected artists. One particular area, a kind of basement, we're going to invite the artists who've done the best work in conceptual art. We feel that particular site just lends itself to conceptual art. In other areas, we will invite artists to do particular kinds of work, whether it's a mural on a wall, whether it's a large sculptural piece that's going to hang in front of the library, at the end of the gallery, running down past the Great African Steps. And so in establishing this building, we are doing more than simply creating a delightful place for people like me to work. Those of you who love art, can you think of anything better going to work and seeing, on your way to your office, just seeing this lovely, lovely art, and art given with love by the artist, not bought with a lot of money, given with love, with that feeling, that serendipitous feeling of rightness that comes when people offer something out of grace and not simply to achieve some kind of fame or for mercenary purposes. So the loose art we already have, but to me the most exciting part won't be the loose art in the gallery. The most exciting part will be the artists putting their hands and their imaginations onto the very fabric of the building itself, and to do so as the building is being constructed. I've had a tiny role in that. The least artistic, the least elegant intervention will be by the 11 judges on the court. We've been asked to write something up in the concrete in the foyer, the entrance to the court building. We chose the phrase human dignity, equality, and freedom. These are the motifs that run through our Bill of Rights. Human dignity, equality, and freedom. And we happen to have 11 judges and 11 official languages. The architects didn't want to simply print human equality, human dignity, equality, and freedom. They said, let the judges write. The judges are people. The court isn't just a building. It's a building animated by the human beings who sit on the bench, who function there. So they wanted handwriting. And so my rather feeble handwriting in the Tsonga language is going to say human dignity, equality, and freedom. And I just say with a certain sadness, because every author, I think, likes to think their ideas are cast in stone, in concrete. Quite literally, our words will be cast in concrete. After I lost my arm in the bomb blast, and I lost my signature, I lost my watch that I got when I was 13, I thought, well, now's my chance, learning to write with my left hand. Instead of having that very feeble schoolboy handwriting I had before, I can get a Mont Blanc pen, aristocratic handwriting. And in the hospital, I'm learning, I'm doing dog, 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 round figures, and fly, 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 long figures, pages of it. And it came out like a feeble schoolboy handwriting. So that feeble schoolboy handwriting is literally cast in concrete. I think it's already been done now in that building. So that's my modest, totally non-aesthetically exciting contribution. But we have a team, an artworks committee working with the architects on this. And few things in what's been a rather eventful life that I've had, I would say, have given me more delight and more pleasure and more agony and more strain than being part and parcel of this whole process. There are some things where you just have one real chance. And we have this one real chance, a chance to make that building not just a building that functions well in a memorable setting, but a building that tells the world, that tells our people, that tells visitors that space matters, that light matters, that the environment that you're in matters, that the connections with the world around you matter, that law matters, that human rights matter, that art matters, that beauty matters. And we have this very honorable privilege of being able to concentrate all those different dimensions in one particular activity. Margaret has told you what the decision was in the Nevirapine case. We did order the government to make the drops of Nevirapine available to those doctors in public facilities who felt they were medically indicated, who could control the distribution, who could test the mothers concerned, get informed consent, ensure that the babies afterwards got the drop, and thereby saving thousands of lives, saving thousands of children each year from being born with the HIV virus and the terrible prognostication that went with that. And we delivered the judgment on behalf of the court. The courtroom was packed with people, black and white, mainly young, male and female, wearing T-shirts saying HIV positive. And as we went back through the doors into the foyer, I heard cheering and I cried.
I'm sure, like myself, we have all been deeply moved by your remarks. I feel humbled and almost incapable of speaking after that, although most of my students at UMass Boston would find that difficult to believe. And I'm not quite sure where to begin in the 4 or 5 or 10 minutes that I might take to say a few words, because you have brought to us and for us such a wealth of feeling, profundity about life, and a sense of the meaning of things. And to me, as a professor at the only public university in the Athens of America, all of that touches home. It touches home on a number of levels, but perhaps particularly for what you've spoken about in terms of the right for people to work and be involved with areas of beauty, and that everything should have meaning. Sometimes one might think that Columbia Point and South Boston is a long ways even from downtown. Certainly it's a long ways from Johannesburg. But I've spent almost 25 years of my professional career there. It's been a very interesting experience, certainly not with the strife and difficulties that you have suffered. But I was reminded a while ago when I was meeting with someone from Cambridge about fundraising, that she said, well, now, how long does it take to get to Columbia Point? I thought, my Lord, you've lived here in Cambridge for almost 40 years, and you've never traveled down the Southeast Expressway or taken the Red Line to Ashmont and gotten off to go to Columbia Point? I was staggered. However, not being from Boston, being a New Yorker myself, I had to realize that there is a certain provincial quality about every city in America, and it's not exclusive to Boston as well. However, she did come and she did support this Arts on the Point project at UMass. And as some of you may know, Columbia Point had been ignored for so long because it had a housing project that was built there in the 1960s in the classic case of urban renewal, which really meant minority removal from the center of the city. And they built these high-rise buildings there that were absolutely ghastly in their regularity and their unflinching geometry. And within approximately 15 years, they had fallen into almost complete ruin. 90% of the people who had lived there, almost all of which had been minorities, had moved out. And when I came to UMass in 1978, most of the buildings were boarded up. Some people held on, mostly because that was all they had. And thus, when the university was established there, once again in the glorious democratic days of the 1960s, when there was vision within this government, which I think has been enormously narrowed, they built it on that landfill site because they didn't want to give us any free land downtown, tax-free land, that is, and we had grown so much because there was such need in this city for public education, for the opportunities for people without means to be able to have vision and to find meaning in the world. Eventually, however, all of that has changed. In fact, those housing projects have been entirely remodeled, much to the pleasure of those who are out there. In addition, the university itself has grown enormously. This is a small plug for the university. You have to forgive me in these circumstances, but we are 13,000 strong, and it's one of the most interesting places to teach and to be. I've had the privilege of private education all my life, but when I get into the elevator at UMass Boston, I am often the only white male in that elevator. There's 45% of our student body of 13,000 are students of color of some kind. And when they are there on this godforsaken peninsula, windswept, landfilled, bubbling with gases from who knows what underneath, I felt, after having organized these various Monet exhibitions here at the Museum of Fine Arts, which were the Sammy Sosa and Mark McGuire thrillers of their particular aesthetic type, that we here in Boston had had enough of Monet, or certainly enough of Impressionism, although I guess we can never get enough, and that what this city needed was to be able to engage with the contemporary and to likewise, at the same time, be able to provide for our students a place of dignity, a place that had meaning, a place that was involved with beauty. And so I cashed in my art world chits and went around to all the people who had helped me in the past. I'm sure there are some similarities in all of this, to be able to attract large-scale outdoor sculpture, because I felt we should make lemonade out of lemons. If we have a flat, unarticulated space with these ghastly rectilinear buildings that had absolutely no humanity whatsoever, that there should be a sense of the human presence there. And thank goodness people responded. They even responded, and they responded immediately when they were brought out by me, not kicking or screaming, but when they were seduced to be able to come to see the site, they immediately recognized what the problem was. The problem was some kind of attempt at reconciliation between a kind of government imposition of an aesthetic and the place of the human therein. Again, not without some parallels therein, although happily, again, our struggles pale in contrast to your own. And happily, over the last 4 or 5 years, we actually have gathered together a representative sample of works by contemporary artists. I won't list them and the like, but I would also like to add that we have the largest number of works are actually by artists from Ghana who have made for us and for others, you can have one yourself, fantasy coffins or fantasy afterlife vehicles, which are wooden and which were made to be able to transport the deceased into the afterlife in the vision that he or she wanted, which is to say, perhaps in the Mercedes that you could never purchase, or perhaps in the form of a corn cob that had actually been the staple of your life, or a large fish so that you could be one with the oceans with which you had worked. And all of these are installed inside, much, I might add, to the dismay of many good Irish Catholics who are always worried about what might happen on their other side of that divide. But nonetheless, the basic point is that taking a place and making it meaningful, to be able to reconcile the contradictions of our contemporary world, and specifically to be able to inject dignity into a place that seemed to be without it. And this startled many people here in Boston, largely because it is, as I say, the only public university. When I did these exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts, they would turn to me and they'd say, "Oh, this is such a wonderful show. So you teach at Harvard?" And I would say, "No, I don't." "Oh, BU?" I said, "No." BC? No. Northeastern? No. And I began to just sit there and let them run through the list. Initially, I, of course, would correct them, and quite hastily, but I began to realize that it's not I who should be embarrassed, it should be them. And that in the end, the notion that art could not somehow or other be a part of a public environment, that art was supposed to only be for those, quote-unquote, private institutions, or only to be found at the Museum of Fine Arts. In fact, we just installed a big de Kooning, which is a mate to the one in front of the Museum of Fine Arts, and a better one, I might add, as well. Art, in the end, is distinctly and utterly and purely social. It is an act of the human against ignorance. It is an embrace of the imagination, and it's a leap of daring, which all of us deserve and all of us can embrace. Thank you.
Well, there you have a marriage here. UMass Boston and Johannesburg, South Africa, and an interesting one at that. And I open it up for your comments and your questions. Don't all speak at once. Or your...
I'd love to actually ask the judge as to how the artists were selected for the courthouse, because we've had a lot of controversy about that as well, particularly when it's supposed to be a public environment. There's always a certain tension between those selection processes, so I'd love to hear some.
The artists in the gallery, in a way, selected themselves. They donated their work. I opened many exhibitions, and once some of our leading artists had donated something, I could drop big hints. And we got support from galleries. Linda Goodman, some of you might know, she's been a tremendous support. But when I told people in other galleries how marvelous Linda had been, they didn't want to be left out. So that's why I call it a very serendipitous kind of selection. It wasn't a procurement body that had X amount of money, quantum of money to go out and buy art. The art found us. And I'd like to mention in particular the Lorraine Traskelson, who's married to the Chief Justice of South Africa, said, "Albie, you must go and see work by Judith Mason." And I went to see some work by her, and it was also based on the Truth Commission. Judith was listening to the radio, the coverage of the Truth Commission, and she heard about an African woman, guerrilla freedom fighter, whose body had been found in a shallow grave with a bullet wound through the head. And the body was nude except for some panties made of plastic bag. And the assumption was that she had found the plastic bag and covered her nakedness with this. So Judith sewed a dress out of pieces of blue plastic bag for her sister who died, to give her coverage. some kind of cover, and did a painting of the dress floating in the sky with a predator animal, wolf-like animal, and a sort of fence in between. And that's the picture that I saw, the image that I saw. And I said, Judith, you know, we would love it for the court. And she said, Albie, you must just take it. Now she's living on almost nothing, a fine artist, but not doing much teaching, dependent solely on her art. I said, it's so hard. And people coming to court might be repelled by it. Couldn't she do something softer? So she did the same dress floating, the same predator, but with African funerary objects, coals burning and cups and so on. And I said, Judith, that's too soft. And she said, well, in the end, you must take the dress and the hard picture and the soft picture. And I gave her a little bit of money that I had in my pocket. She was thrilled that her work was being represented in the courts, that we'd achieved democracy in South Africa, defending the Constitution. And then Gerald Gordon, a well-known leading attorney in Cape Town, who had written a number of books, who had appeared in a number of, for the defense in political trials. When Gerald died, his wife wanted to find some way of honoring him, and she was thinking of a bench in a park. And I said, why don't you give Judith some money for this particular work? And we had a little meeting in the courtroom, and Judith was there, and Nancy Gordon was there, and the Chief Justice and the Deputy Chief Justice. And the Deputy Chief Justice was the last to speak, and he said he'd been in the trial where the African woman had been put down as a witness. She'd never appeared, and the story the prosecution put out was she'd run away. Meanwhile, of course, they'd murdered her because presumably she refused to testify. So the whole story came round. It's a living presence in our building. Well, each item that we have has a story behind it like that. But now we're in a completely different phase. Now we are spending a certain amount of public funds, but we only got 1% of the building for public art. And we've had to rely very much on international support because we can't go to the private sector in South Africa. They might be litigants before us. They'd be only too pleased. The diamond industry, gold mines. I said to my colleagues, well, if we get money from business and then we go to the unions afterwards, won't that balance out? And they said, no, because they also might be before us. And no one must feel one day that the court is too cozy with any donors. In event, the money that we've got, we feel is in a kind of public trust, and we want to feel that the artist community as a whole is having a chance. At the same time, we want the William Kentridges to feel, even if it's not nearly market rates what he can command, that they'll get something and be attracted by the offer. So what we've done is we've divided up the artworks into quite a big range. Some will be completely open competition, and people must just send in the concepts. We don't want maquettes, we don't want drawings, we don't want paintings, we want concepts. And so we might have, and then some we are inviting clutches, groups of artists to work on particular projects. For example, there are huge wooden doors, the doorway to the court, and we have some very good carvers from all different communities. So we will invite some of them to participate in that. The conceptual art I've already mentioned. And there are about 6 projects like that, and between them you get quite a big range. It might be 20 or 30 different artists, different parts of the country being invited, but it's not 20 or 30 artists for each project. Then they might feel, well, it's really not worth the candle. It's for the different projects. That's one way. Other things will be completely open. Then we're going to have particular things like the scratching on the etching on the windows. I'm not sure exactly how we've decided for that. Particular sculptural projects, again, it might be a limited group. But as I say, other things will be open to everybody.
I was going to say, isn't it too bad that Mr. Cobb, who had been the architect for our federal courthouse down in Fampier, didn't have the same kind of vision as yourself?
Well, let me just pick up on 2 points. One is in respect to our federal courthouse. I think Justice Sachs passed through when the plans were being laid for our new courthouse, which was the doors of which opened in 1998 to national attention and acclaim. And certainly there are some who think it's a beautiful structure, and that the art, it does give a new sense of what is meant by justice, but it doesn't. It goes no way towards solving the problems that justice is still too expensive, too inaccessible for any, and that no real work involving real people actually takes place in that building. That's an overstatement, of course, but it's to make the point. That's one thing. And the second point here is the structure you describe sounds really quite wonderful, but isn't the court concerned about the delivery of justice in hustings? And you've built this wonderful, art from across the globe, sculpture, gardens, and I'm sure, but you've got to dispense justice in the provinces and in the small distant towns where there aren't enough judges, and where the lawyers are poorly trained, and where there aren't translators for the 11 languages in which the proceedings take place. So how do you reconcile the inevitable envy and jealousies that are going to emerge when you've got this great and grand court sitting in the capital and very little going on elsewhere?
I've been several times to the federal courthouse from when it was first being conceived, and in fact a very lovely friendship with Stephen Breyer emerged from that because he was heavily involved. And I went in during construction. I've been there since, and I'm hoping I might have another look at it. And I'm not going to pass any comment. I don't know it well enough. I don't know what it means to people in Boston. So I look at it with great interest. It's a very striking building, and it gives vitality and life to a sector of an environment that was, I understand, very dead and abandoned beforehand. It's certainly the philosophy in terms of the artwork is almost as opposite as one can get. It's a fine example, I would say. Is Jim Dine, is that right? No, Ellsworth Kelly. Very, very serene, very controlled, very beautiful in its own terms of abstract presentations. We do have some abstract art, but basically with us it's the human being, the human figure, the vitality, the rhythm, the variety, the diversity, that's what it's all about, and the participation by many artists, famous, not famous, known, unknown, rural, urban, in different techniques. And that's part of the answer to what you say. This mustn't look like a government building up on the hill that's palatial and out of reach and not belonging to everybody. The sense of belonging comes from the actual texture and fabric itself. But also we are very aware this is a flagship building for justice, and we have a responsibility to the whole nation, primarily through the justice that we dispense, but also through what's symbolized in the court and the place of the court. We expect school children from all over the country to visit us. We expect tourists to come there and see, so that it becomes a place of national involvement and interest, and the story of where our Constitution comes from will be impressed on people in a very physical material sense. But in addition, when we are preparing for the launching of the court, which will probably be in February 2004, we're going to have groups going out throughout the country so that they will think Constitution Hill is the apex of the judiciary of which we are part. And we're insisting that we link up with the judiciary in all the different regions. And I'm going to be very, very busy speaking precisely in this particular connection, and other colleagues of mine. A certain measure of envy, I think, I suppose can't really be avoided. And the truth is that conditions in many of our courts are abysmal. Particularly the holding cells for prisoners don't meet with constitutional standards. And that's one reason why there's no lavishness in our courts. It's actually a fairly simple building in terms of its design. The cost was something in the order of $12 million for the whole building. And the artwork funding we're getting externally from wherever we can. A number of governments have helped us. Ford Foundation have been extremely supportive, one way and another. The artists contributing well below what they could command in terms of market rates. So we have to bear in mind the point that you're making, but not be dominated by it, so that we don't end up doing something that's, as I say, once in a lifetime thing that you can do.
Can you tell us your name?
My name is Lee Gifford, and I'm from Foster, Rhode Island. It sounds clear to me that you're counting on this new courthouse to be a symbol for the democracy that you're trying to put together. I'm wondering if you could comment or expand on some of the ways that this democracy has affected the citizens of South Africa in the last 10 years.
Why don't we collect a few questions first, and then the hour's late. Tell us your name and your questions.
Hi, my name is Judith Lieben. I have a very small question, which is in the courthouse. It's a small question but meaningful to people who are in courtrooms. How high up and how far away from the people in the courtroom is the bench where the judges sit, and which to me is extremely important, not just as a short person, but as someone who has to figure out what the majesty of the law means in terms of height. And some even smaller questions. Do you continue, are there special, this isn't architectural, but it's in terms of garb, or do you continue with some special robes and wigs or whatever might have come from the British system, and what sorts of things like that have changed?
My name is Lorraine Lyman, and I've had to think a lot about an argument for public money for public art, because that's one of the first things cut here. As you all know, we've had a 62% cut in our art budget. So I wondered whether you would go along with this excuse. I've looked for the biological level. It seems to me we're made of a physical element, an emotional element, and a spiritual element. We feed and water the physical with food and water. We feed and water the emotional with art and spiritual life, and the same for spiritual life. My feeling is if we're going to save money, instead of cutting out the emotional needs, which is what we do by cutting art projects, we should cut out the physical needs, and then all we need to budget for is shovels. So I wondered if you go along with that argument. Thank you.
It's a pleasant thought. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Mark Jones, and I have a comment and a question. From what I've heard and from what I've read, I don't think anything has really changed that much in South Africa. I think that the Europeans who call themselves white South Africans still control the economics of the country, and therefore they control the country. I think that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is in a sense absurd, because I asked myself the question, why didn't the victims of the Nazi Holocaust use a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? And furthermore, if the shoe was on the other foot, where you had Africans committing unspeakable crimes against Europeans, would Europeans seek out a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? My question is, do you one day see the so-called strategic natural resources that the Oppenheimer family controls, which is the gold, platinum and uranium deposits on the continent. Do you see that in indigenous African hands one day?
Thank you. Well, everybody sit tight because we'll work through that.
Democracy has given everybody in South Africa, but particularly those who were oppressed before, two things almost immediately. The one is dignity, and you sense it and you feel it all the time in our country. This idea of people getting off the pavement, because they're in the way of somebody who's got power, that just doesn't exist anymore. The sense of being somebody, the pride that all of us get when we see the whole world flocking to be photographed next to Nelson Mandela, a person of our soil, of our country, articulating our emotions and our hopes and our courage in his own very lovely, special way. It gives pride to all South Africans of all backgrounds, but especially to those who've been subjected to all the humiliations and the marginalization of the past. And that was almost immediate with democracy. The second thing it's given us is a constitution and institutions of government that enable people to speak out and say what they want to say, to organize, to ensure the conflicts that we have are not resolved by means of guns and bombs and spears. And the intense problems that we have in our country, and they are still huge, don't go away, but the sense is that we have the institutions and the mechanisms for dealing with them without tearing the country apart. And that comes very, very quickly, and these institutions are well established. I have the honor and the intellectual joy and the personal pleasure of sitting on one of the institutions, that's the Constitutional Court. And frequently we've ruled against the government, against Mandela, President Mandela, against President Mbeki, not as directly as we did against President Mandela. And our decisions are accepted. The rule of law is strong, it's alive and well in our country. And in fact, just recently in the first batch of honors given by the President, the Chief Justice of South Africa, who's the head of our court, Arthur Chaskelson, and certainly one of the greatest lawyers in the world today, was a recipient of that particular award. The change in life circumstances has been much slower. We can point to the fact that 1 million brick homes have been built for people living in the shacks, maybe 4, 5, 6 million people moving out of shacks into brick homes with water, electricity. They own the land they can build on. We can point to the fact that something like 5 million people have direct access to clean running water who didn't have it before. And 6 or 7 million people have electricity who didn't have it before. And that there's free health care for children under 6 and mother and child care, also free access in the hospitals. But this is just touching on huge inequality in our country. And it's an inequality that goes well beyond simply access to mineral resources, to which one of the questioners referred. It's land, but it's access to education, access to skills. access to the economy, to capital, to know-how. We're dealing with all of these, sometimes well, sometimes not so well. As far as mining capital is concerned, an arrangement has been worked out between the government and the big mining houses to ensure that within a couple of years, a certain figure, I think it's 25% of shares, will be in black hands. And this is just the beginning of a longer process. So the issue is on the agenda, specifically in relation to mining. But I wouldn't exaggerate the importance of mining in our countries. Only 2% of the domestic product comes from mining, although we're seen as a country of gold and diamonds, platinum, and so on. It's like any rapidly industrializing country. It's financial services, it's information technology. That's the area where people have to get in and where we need the whole nation participating and not just those who are children of those who benefited from privilege in the past. There's not a single area in public life where the question of overcoming the racial inequalities isn't being tackled. In terms of the judiciary, it's race and gender very much on the agenda. It's slow, but we are making headway. Access to universities has changed the profile of students enormously, but not the profile of the professors. So right at the top, we have many black principals of the universities, vice-chancellors. Amongst the students, a majority of black students, a large number of women students, but amongst the professors, particularly the senior professors, the old inequalities still manifest themselves. As far as the Truth Commission is concerned, the Truth Commission, presided over by Desmond Tutu, with some people, extraordinary people like Pumla, whom I've just mentioned, participating in it, was a very exceptional process. It dealt with pain. It dealt with tragedy. It didn't transform South Africa. It didn't purport to transform South Africa. And to me, the most sad aspect of it, extraordinary though it was, in opening up the emotions and securing a tiny measure of apology and in getting acknowledgement that anybody is capable of being an oppressor, that even those of us who were involved in the freedom struggle were capable of treating people in our hands in an unjust way, as Margaret pointed out. We had to acknowledge that. Nobody is born naturally, inevitably right and correct right through their lives. And nobody inherits through history, through the most honorable struggle, an automatic divine right of being right. We're all capable of doing wrong. And we've got to recognize that. That's why we have a constitution. That's why these institutions are so important. And that's why the Truth Commission was so important. For enabling South Africans, black and white, to live in the same moral territory. For the whites to acknowledge the massacres, the tortures, the violence, but also for those of us in the freedom struggle to acknowledge injustices committed by ourselves in the name of the struggle for freedom. That had to be done so that we could move on. But the great sadness was when the daily sessions were over, the perpetrators of terrible crimes, sometimes having acknowledged on television, sometimes crying their power defeated, total moral collapse of the old order visible to the whole nation. Nevertheless, they get into their cars and they drive home to beautiful homes. And the people from the families who'd suffered so much don't have cars. They're on, if they have bicycles, or more likely they get into what we call the taxis, the combis. They go to the townships, and the inequalities are still there in our society. And until we overcome those inequalities, we will never have full reconciliation. But what the Truth Commission did was at least open up the way morally for reconciliation. I think it did an extraordinary job. The people involved paid a heavy emotional price for what they were doing, but contributed something to us, to Africa, and to the world. A world in which many people seem to feel that problems and serious problems have to be solved simply by showing we are stronger than you, we can defeat you, we can destroy you, we can stamp you out, we can enforce our will simply because we are more powerful. And we in South Africa are trying to find another way of dealing with what might appear to be intractable problems. Now to get to some of the easier questions. The bench on which I'll be sitting in the court will not be as high as this table. I'm looking down on you. The shape of the court will be dipped so that people sitting at the back, many of them will be a little higher than the judges, but the eyes of counsel will be more or less the same as, at the same level as the eyes of the judges. It's something that we've already achieved in the court that we're in at the moment, and it's something that we appreciate very much. It's a kind of dialogue between the bench and counsel, and we regard that as essential to the character of the court that we want. We don't have wigs. We do have gowns. We have bibs. I regard them as a little bit over-elaborate, but I was involved with the decor of the court, not the dress of the judges. So I go along with that. I've got fairly used to the robes. But we're not called anymore my lord or my lady. We're not referred to as honorable. We don't feel we need these titles. We're simply called judge or justice. And that's a change in the South African tradition, which we can introduce as a new court. It's more difficult in the older courts. I think I've answered all the questions.
Well, thank you. And thank all of you for coming. Justice Sachs, Professor Tucker, thank you for your contributions to this evening. And we can all go back out in the college.